Hey everybody, NecroVMX here, and boy do I loves me some top 10 lists, and I'll be showing it like a motherfucker. That's right, it's the next video in NecroVMX's top 10 best video game series ever, and today we're up to number 6. And as you can see, number 6 is the Metroid series. Ah man, what can I say about Metroid? This series has been around almost as long as Nintendo has been around, and very first Metroid, I gotta tell you about this one. I first got this game on the NES. I didn't actually have it. I got it from a friend of mine. I borrowed it from him, and I had it for a really long time until both me and my mom beat the game. We had it, and it was such a great game, but it took us a long time to beat it. And then when I was ready to give it back to him, he said that he had sold his NES and all of his games to get a Sega Genesis, which was great for him because he got a Sega Genesis, and it was great for me because I got a free copy of Metroid. And it took so long because it's such an immersive game, and I gotta tell you about it. Metroid was a very long game. It was probably the longest game on the NES at the time that it came out, and that was mostly because it was the first game to use a password system, so they can make it as long as they want, and you would just get the password and continue some other time. Although the password was really long, and it was a pain in the ass, because if you wrote it down wrong, you would be forced to either start from the beginning or use one of your older passwords, or even if you wrote it down perfect, sometimes it would just be messed up. Another thing about Metroid, I think it was the first game to have multiple endings. Depending on how fast you beat the game, you would get different endings. And I also think it was probably definitely the first video game that you play as a female character. I mean, and I'm not counting all those like weird porno games for the Atari. I'm talking about like real video games. I mean, Samus was a girl, and this is something that, we didn't know when we bought the game at the time. I mean, it was, automatically assumed that Samus was a guy because Samus was the hero, and the manual actually lied to you and told you that Samus was a dude, and it wasn't until you beat the game, as long as you got one of the better endings, that you found out that Samus was a chick. Because back then, in the 80s, video games, girls were just prizes to be won. They were damsels in distress. They weren't the main characters. They weren't the heroes. And, when they did appear in, like, RPGs, they were secondary characters. They were usually healers. They weren't very strong physically. And Samus was the first, lead female character. And the fact that it was a surprise kind of, like, you beat this game, and by the way, you've been playing as a girl. It's kind of cool. And, it wasn't until years later that Metroid 2 Return of Samus came out on the Game Boy, and because it's many years between each entry in the series, because Nintendo EAD, you could tell that they take a lot of time, care, and effort to put into the Metroid series, and they won't release them until they're just perfect. There's usually only one on each system. The only system that I can think of that has more than one Metroid game that isn't, that are main games that aren't like remakes or spin-offs is the GameCube. So, I mean, and then there was Metroid 3 on the Super NES, and that one came near the end of the Super NES. And it's like at the beginning, when the Super NES came out, I mean, you had your Mario, you had your Zelda, you had your Castlevania, you had all the classics except for Metroid, and it came out way, way later, almost when the Nintendo 64 was ready to come out. And when you play it, it's like one of the most perfect games that you could ever play, and it's like, wow, I'm so glad they waited, because they perfected it, and then Metroid 4, whereas it's called Metroid Fusion, came out on the Game Boy Advance, and that came out on the same day as Metroid Prime, which I'm going to talk more about in a second. But, I mean, each game adds something new to it, and I mean, Metroid 2 was, more story-driven, and it was darker, and it was harder, and it was a little bit more linear, so you didn't feel like, as Angry Video Game Nerd puts it, a rat in a maze, which is what Metroid made you feel like. And it added new weapons and new items and everything. And then Super Metroid kind of brought it back to its roots, but it also introduced all these new things like the grappling beam and the scanner and the super bombs and the super missiles and all these cool weapons, all these like secret combos that you could make, and little secrets that you could find, and wall jumps and shit. It was fucking great. And then Metroid Fusion added, you know, all these stealth aspects and the wall climbing and the acrobatics and everything. And so that was a really cool one. And, you know, when we all heard of this Metroid Prime thing that was coming out, it's like there was no Metroid game on the Nintendo 64, which was a disappointment. But even though Nintendo kept hinting at it. But then it came out on the GameCube, and it's like when we first heard about it, it seemed like it was going to be a disaster. It was going into first person, which is weird for a Metroid game, and you know, and it was being farmed out to this other company, so it wasn't Nintendo EAD's in-house developers making it. It was this other, I think they're called Retro. So it was like you're letting other people make your games, and you're making them into first-person shooters. This is gonna suck. What the fuck are you doing to my Metroid? And then you see the screenshots, and they look like ass. It didn't really look like anything. It just looked like a clusterfuck. And then when you actually see the game in motion, you realize it does look great. And when you actually play it, you realize it plays great. And it's like, man, your faith in Nintendo is just restored right there, because Metroid Prime was so great. And I mean, the only criticism I have against the game is that it tends to freeze every once in a while. Although I know there's certain spots where it sometimes does freeze, so I'll always save before that. But man, what a pain in the ass that could be. And then there was, you know, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, which a lot of people had issues with. They said it was too hard, and the beginning areas were really not all that great. But man, that one gets so much better. It's such a rewarding game to go through, especially because it is so hard. And now there's the new one, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, on the Wii. And although I was, you know, at first upset because I don't have a Wii, and I was hoping that they would finish out the trilogy on the GameCube where it started, you know, just the idea of motion controls in a first-person game. I mean, these games don't really feel like first-person shooters. They don't feel like Doom or Quake or GoldenEye or anything like that. They feel like Metroid. It just so happens that you're looking through the visor as Samus. And, you know, the depth of storytelling that they've brought to it is amazing. And I mean, you know, those are all the main games, but there's some other ones. There's Metroid Zero Mission, which is for Game Boy Advance, which is sort of a remake, sort of really a reimagining of the very first game, and that added a whole new part to the end that had to do with, you know, stealth and running away from the enemies and getting your items back before you can fight anything. And, you know, and of course there was Metroid Prime Hunters on the DS, which is, you know, sort of like a Metroid Prime game, but the focus is really more on multiplayer, I think, with that one. And then, I mean, there's even a fucking pinball game, and how weird is that? Well, I guess it's not that weird. I mean, you have, like, you know, all these weird Mario games, like tennis and go-karts and shit, so why not a Metroid pinball game? And I mean, you know, Samus does roll up into a ball, and, you know, so there's that. And I mean, there was a Sonic pinball game. I mean, they called it Sonic Spinball, but there was a Mario pinball game. I really don't like pinball, so I haven't played that one. But just the idea that they could release that and people would buy it because it's Metroid, it shows this is a quality series. It really is one of Nintendo's most beloved franchise, and Samus is one of Nintendo's most beloved characters. You know, she's in Smash Brothers, and, you know, she's one of the best characters there, too. You play as Samus, and you just have this huge arsenal at your disposal. I mean, just like in the Metroid games, there's a million different ways to handle a situation. And it's not just an action game, there's so much more to it. It's about exploration, it's about puzzle solving, it's about figuring out where to go next, it's about using your items to get around your surroundings and such. And, you know, some of them are more linear than others. Metroid Fusion is kind of linear, and Metroid 2 Return of Samus is very linear. But for the most part, they're non-linear games that you just discover new areas as you go along due to the increased abilities and better weapons and items that you get as you encounter this. And one thing that I've always wondered is, like, you know, in sequels, how come you always start off with, like, no weapons? Shouldn't you have all your crap from the previous game? And I like how in, you know, Metroid Prime, which takes place after the first Metroid, you know, it actually explains how you lose all your stuff. So that was pretty cool. You know, and so the Metroid games, they're really amazing. And, You know, the 2D games are great, the 3D games are great, and not many series can do both, and Metroid is one of them that can do both. And from what I understand, Corruption is the last in the Metroid Prime series, and they're not going to do any more of those. And I don't know if that means a total end to the 3D Metroids, or if it means just an end to that particular series, so I don't know where they're going to go with it next. But it's nice that they're not, you know, running it into the ground or anything. Well, anyway, that's Metroid, number 6 on my list, and we'll see you guys soon with number 5.